What if everything you thought you knew about England was just the surface? Beneath the rolling green hills, beyond the quaint villages and ancient stone walls, there's another England. A hidden one. A place where legends walk, where shadows breathe, and where the past refuses to stay buried. This isn't the England of postcards and tourism brochures. This is the England of whispers in the fog, of ancient curses that still echo through ruined castles, and of mysteries that no historian has ever been able to fully explain. You're about to step into a world where the line between history and myth is so thin, it might as well not exist at all. Because in England, some stories are too strange to be fiction and too persistent to be lies. For over 1,000 years, this land has been shaped by invasion, bloodshed, faith, and fear. Romans carved their names into the earth. Vikings brought tales of war hounds and cursed beasts. Saxons whispered of spirits that lurked in ancient forests. And the Normans built castles where ghosts still roam today. But what most people don't realize is that every layer of England's history left behind something more than ruins. It left behind stories. And some of those stories? They never died. They evolved. They adapted. And they're still being told right now, in the 21st century, on social media, in late-night forums, and in viral videos of unexplained sightings. England's folklore isn't a relic of the past. It's alive. Take King Arthur, for example. Everyone knows his name. The legendary king who pulled a sword from a stone and united Britain. But did you know that in 1191, monks at Glastonbury Abbey claimed they found his actual grave? Or that Richard the Lionheart allegedly gave away the real Excalibur as a diplomatic gift? And just a few years ago, researchers in Cambridge discovered a rare 13th century manuscript about Merlin and Arthur, hidden inside the binding of an old property book for over 500 years. It survived by accident, folded, torn, stitched into obscurity until modern technology brought it back to light. That's the thing about English legends. They refuse to disappear. They resurface when you least expect them, demanding to be remembered. Or consider the Pendle Witches. In 1612, 12 people were accused of witchcraft in Lancashire. 10 of them were hanged. Their trials were some of the most infamous in English history, rooted in fear, superstition, and religious hysteria. But here's where it gets interesting. In 2024, a major TV documentary revisited their story, and campaigns have been launched to posthumously pardon them. Suddenly, a 400-year-old tragedy is back in the public eye, sparking debates about justice, prejudice, and how we remember the victims of mass hysteria. The past isn't past in England. It's a living, breathing thing that keeps coming back. And then there are the creatures. The monsters. The things that shouldn't exist but somehow never quite go away. Black Shuck, a massive spectral dog with eyes like fire, has been terrorizing travelers since medieval times. Spring-heeled Jack, a claw-fingered demon in a skin-tight suit, leapt across Victorian London rooftops and breathed blue flames into women's faces. The Owlman of Cornwall was spotted in the 1970s, hovering near a churchyard with glowing red eyes. And just last year, a road in the UK was officially named the most haunted place in the country after countless reports of a ghostly figure causing accidents. These aren't dusty old fairy tales. People are still seeing these things. Still reporting them. Still trying to make sense of them. But here's what makes England's folklore truly unique. It's not just about ghosts and monsters. It's about identity. It's about power. And lately, it's become controversial. Because in recent years, English myths have been weaponized in political debates about what it means to be English. Who gets to claim these stories? Who gets to rewrite them? Some argue that folklore is being mined to serve radical agendas. Others say it's being reclaimed to make England's heritage more inclusive. Either way, the battle over these ancient tales is heating up, and it's happening right now. So what are we going to do in this video? We're going deep. We're going to explore the legends that shaped England, the mysteries that still haunt it, and the controversies that are tearing apart how people see their own history. We'll talk about kings and witches, monsters and miracles, curses and cover-ups. And by the end, you might start to wonder, Are the real ghosts of England its legends? Or the secrets it still refuses to admit? Every legend starts with a question. And the question that has haunted England for over 1,000 years is simple: did King Arthur ever exist? Was there really a warrior king who pulled a magical sword from stone, united a broken Britain, and became the greatest hero in all of English folklore? Or is he just a dream? A fantasy invented by medieval monks and poets to give people hope in dark times? Here's the truth. Nobody knows. And that mystery is exactly why Arthur refuses to die. Let's go back to the beginning. The earliest mention of Arthur appears around the year 828 in a text called the Historia Britonum. It describes him not as a king, but as a military commander who fought 12 battles against Saxon invaders in the late 5th or early 6th century. One of those battles was the Battle of Badon Hill, where Arthur supposedly killed 960 men single-handedly. Sounds impossible, right? It probably is. But here's what matters. Historians believe there was a real battle at Badon Hill, and the Saxons did lose. Archaeological evidence shows that Anglo-Saxon migration into Britain actually reversed between 500 and 550 AD, meaning something stopped them. Someone stopped them. And the Welsh called that someone Arthur. But as the centuries passed, Arthur transformed. He went from being a warlord to a king. From a historical footnote to a literary icon. By the time Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote his History of the Kings of Britain in 1136, Arthur had become a legendary monarch with a magical sword, a wizard advisor named Merlin, and a kingdom called Camelot. Geoffrey's Arthur was everything medieval England wanted to believe about itself: noble, powerful, destined for greatness. The problem? Geoffrey probably made most of it up. Modern historians agree that his book is more fiction than fact. But it didn't matter. The legend exploded across Europe, inspiring poets, painters, and kings for generations. And here's where it gets weird. Because even though Arthur was likely just a story, people kept finding evidence that he was real. In 1191, monks at Glastonbury Abbey announced that they had discovered Arthur's grave. They dug deep into the cemetery, beneath 2 ancient stone pyramids, and claimed they found a massive oak coffin. Inside were the bones of a giant man and a smaller skeleton, along with a lead cross inscribed with the words, "Here lies buried the glorious King Arthur and Guinevere, his second wife, in the Isle of Avalon." The discovery caused a sensation. Pilgrims flooded the abbey. Donations poured in. Glastonbury became one of the richest monasteries in England. But there was a problem. Most modern historians believe the whole thing was a scam. In 1184, Glastonbury Abbey had burned down, and the monks desperately needed money to rebuild. So they staged the discovery. They fabricated the cross, planted the bones, and sold the story to a gullible public. And it worked. For centuries, people believed that Glastonbury was Avalon, the mythical resting place of the once and future king. Even King Edward I visited in 1278 to preside over a ceremonial reburial of Arthur's remains. The monks had turned a legend into a lucrative business. But Arthur's story didn't end there. It evolved again in the Tudor period, when King Henry VII used the legend to legitimize his claim to the English throne. Henry traced his lineage back to Arthur, calling himself the fulfillment of the ancient prophecy that Arthur would return to unite Britain. He even named his firstborn son Arthur, hoping to inaugurate a new golden age. When that son died young, his brother became King Henry VIII, and the Tudor dynasty continued to trade on Arthurian propaganda for decades. The point is, Arthur wasn't just a story. He was a political weapon. A tool to justify power, inspire loyalty, and unite a fractured nation. And even today, in the 21st century, Arthur refuses to stay buried. In 2019, researchers at Cambridge University discovered a rare 13th century manuscript hidden inside the binding of a 16th century property book. The manuscript contained stories of Merlin and Arthur, part of a French romance called the Suite Vulgate du Merlin. It had been torn, folded, and stitched into the cover, surviving by accident for over 500 years. When modern imaging technology finally revealed the text, scholars realized they had found one of fewer than 40 surviving manuscripts of this particular Arthurian tale. That's the thing about Arthur. Just when you think the story is over, something new surfaces. And then there are the swords. Oh, the swords. Everyone knows the story of Excalibur, the legendary blade that Arthur pulled from stone to prove his right to rule. But here's the twist, people keep finding swords stuck in rocks. In 2019, archaeologists discovered a 700-year-old sword embedded in solid rock at the bottom of the Varbas River in Bosnia. It was wedged in so tightly that they needed special equipment to pull it out. Immediately, people started calling it the real-life Excalibur. And it's not the only one. In Tuscany, there's a sword lodged in stone at the Montesipi Chapel, believed to have been placed there by a 12th-century saint. In Spain, a 1,000-year-old sword was found buried upright in the ground, reflecting the region's Islamic history. And in France, a legendary sword called Durandal mysteriously disappeared from its centuries-old resting place in 2024, sparking wild theories about who took it and why. So what does all this mean? It means Arthur is more than a man. He's an idea. A symbol that changes depending on who's telling the story and what they need him to represent. For medieval Christians, he was a defender of the faith. For Tudor monarchs, he was proof of divine right. For Victorian writers, he was the embodiment of chivalry and moral order. And today? Today, Arthur is being fought over once again. Far-right groups in England have tried to claim him as a symbol of ethnic purity and national identity, arguing that he represents a true England before immigration and multiculturalism. Meanwhile, progressive scholars are reinterpreting the legends to highlight themes of justice, equality, and resistance to tyranny. The battle over Arthur's legacy is real, and it's happening right now. Because when you control the story of Arthur, you control the story of England itself. And some stories are too powerful to let go. But not all of England's legends are about kings and swords. There's something about a dragon that refuses to die. No matter how many times the story is told, no matter how rational we become, the image of a knight facing down a fire-breathing beast still grips us. And in England, no dragon story is more famous than the legend of St. George. But here's the twist. St. George was never English. He never set foot on British soil. He probably never fought a dragon. And yet, for over 600 years, he's been the patron saint of England, his red cross flying on the English flag. How did a Greek soldier from Turkey become the ultimate symbol of English heroism? And why does his story still spark controversy today? Let's start with the man himself. St. George was born around 280 AD in Cappadocia, which is in modern-day Turkey. His parents were wealthy Christians, and after his father died, his mother took him to Palestine. As a young man, George joined the Roman army and quickly rose through the ranks, becoming an officer of high standing. But his faith put him on a collision course with the emperor. In 303 AD, Emperor Diocletian issued an edict demanding that all Christians in the military renounce their faith or face expulsion and torture. George refused. According to legend, he tore up the edict in public, gave away his wealth, freed those he enslaved, and stood firm in his belief. For that, he was arrested, tortured, and eventually beheaded in Nicomedia on April 23. His martyrdom made him a hero among early Christians, and within a few generations, his name spread across the Roman Empire. But the dragon? That came much later. The earliest known version of St. George slaying a dragon appears in an 11th century Georgian manuscript. By the 12th century, the story had reached Western Europe, brought back by knights returning from the Crusades. These knights claimed that St. George himself had appeared to them in battle, fighting alongside them against Muslim armies at Ansha and Jerusalem. Suddenly, George wasn't just a martyr. He was a warrior saint, a protector of Christendom, and a symbol of military might. And the dragon story fit perfectly into the medieval imagination, where dragons represented the devil, paganism, and everything that threatened Christian civilization. The most famous version of the tale comes from the Golden Legend, written in the 13th century by Jacobus de Voragine, the Archbishop of Genoa. According to this account, a fearsome dragon terrorized the city of Cyrene in Libya, poisoning the air with its toxic breath. The townspeople tried to appease it by offering sheep, but when the livestock ran out, they started sacrificing their own children, chosen by lottery. One day, the king's daughter was selected. She was dressed as a bride and led to the dragon's lair, resigned to her fate. But as she waited to die, St. George appeared on horseback, armed with a lance. He charged the dragon, struck it with his spear, and subdued it by making the sign of the cross. Then he tied the princess's belt around the dragon's neck and led it back to the city, where 15,000 people converted to Christianity on the spot. Only then did George kill the beast, beheading it with his sword as the crowd watched in awe. It's a powerful story. But here's the thing. It's almost certainly not true. Scholars believe the tale was borrowed from older myths, Perseus and Andromeda, Jason and Medea, ancient stories of heroes rescuing maidens from monsters. In medieval Europe, these pagan myths were Christianized, repackaged as saints' legends to teach moral lessons. The dragon became a metaphor for sin, evil, and the forces of chaos. George became the ideal Christian knight, brave, faithful, and obedient to God. The story wasn't meant to be historical. It was meant to inspire. But England didn't care about historical accuracy. English kings latched onto St. George because he embodied everything they wanted their soldiers to be. King Richard the Lionheart invoked George's protection during the Crusades in the 12th century. King Edward III made him the patron saint of England in 1350 when he founded the Order of the Garter, the highest order of chivalry in the realm. And King Henry V famously rallied his troops at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 with the cry immortalized by Shakespeare, "Cry God for Harry, England, and St. George." By then, George was no longer just a foreign saint. He was English. His red cross on a white background became the flag of England. His feast day, April 23rd, became a national celebration. But St. George's popularity hasn't always been smooth sailing. During the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, attitudes toward Catholic saints soured. George's feast day was struck from the calendar under King Edward VI, and some writers denounced him as a heretic and a fraud. The cult of saints, they argued, was papist superstition, incompatible with the new Protestant faith. Yet George survived. Why? Because by then, he had been rebranded. He was no longer just a Catholic martyr. He was a secular symbol of English identity, tied to the legend of King Arthur and the Tudor dynasty's propaganda machine. The Elizabethan poet Edmund Spenser reimagined George as the Red Cross Knight in his epic poem The Faerie Queen, where he represented Protestant England triumphing over Catholic tyranny. George had been reinvented once again, this time as a nationalist icon divorced from his religious roots. And that reinvention continues today. Because in 21st century England, St. George is more controversial than ever. His flag, the Red Cross of St. George, has been co-opted by far-right groups who use it to promote anti-immigrant rhetoric and ethnic nationalism. In 2025, thousands of St. George's flags suddenly appeared on lampposts across English towns and cities, sparking fierce debates. Were they symbols of patriotism and pride? Or were they provocations, displays of exclusionary nationalism that made minorities feel unwelcome? Polls showed that 27% of people viewed flying the English flag as unfavorable, with some describing it as racist. Local councils were caught in the crossroads. Some removed the flags, citing safety concerns and the lack of permits. Others defended them, arguing that people had a right to express patriotism. But the controversy revealed a deeper truth. Symbols have power. And when a symbol like St. George's Cross is claimed by extremists, it forces everyone else to ask, who owns this story? Who gets to define what it means to be English? Some argue that the flag should be reclaimed from the far right, that allowing extremists to monopolize national symbols only empowers them. Others say the damage is already done, that the flag has been tainted beyond repair. It's a battle over identity, heritage, and who gets to speak for the nation. And it's not just the flag. The story of George slaying the dragon itself has become a cultural battleground. For some, it's a timeless tale of good versus evil, a reminder that courage and faith can overcome any obstacle. For others, it's a relic of imperialism and conquest, a myth used to justify violence against those deemed mother. The dragon, they argue, was always a stand-in for enemies of the state, whether pagans, Muslims, or anyone who didn't conform. And George? He was the enforcer, the soldier who did the dirty work in the name of righteousness. But here's the irony. St. George himself was an outsider. He was a Greek-speaking Roman from what is now Turkey. He never visited England. He never claimed to represent English identity. And yet, for centuries, the English have made him their own, bending his story to fit whatever narrative they needed at the time. Maybe that's the real lesson of St. George. Legends aren't static. They evolve. They adapt. And they reflect the anxieties and ambitions of the people who tell them. The dragon never really dies. It just takes on a new form. So what happened to the dragon? In English folklore, the most famous dragon-slaying site is Dragon Hill in Uffington, Berkshire. Local legend claims this is where St. George killed his dragon, and to this day, a patch of chalk remains visible on the hillside where, supposedly, the dragon's blood poisoned the ground so badly that grass refuses to grow. It's a myth, of course. But like all myths, it endures because people want to believe it. They want to believe that evil can be defeated, that heroes exist, and that courage still matters. And maybe, in a world that feels increasingly chaotic, that's not such a bad thing to hold on to. But the question remains, who gets to be the hero? And who gets cast as the dragon? Steal from the rich. Give to the poor. It's one of the most famous phrases in all of folklore, and it's tied to one man, Robin Hood. For over 700 years, his name has been a battle cry for justice, rebellion, and resistance against oppression. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Nobody knows if he was real. There's no birth certificate, no grave, no definitive proof that Robin Hood ever existed. And yet, he might be more powerful because of it. Because when a legend has no single face, it can become anything. A hero. A criminal. A socialist icon. A far-right nationalist symbol. Robin Hood is whoever you need him to be, and that's exactly why his story never dies. The earliest written mention of Robin Hood appears in William Langland's poem Piers Plowman, written around 1377. In it, a character casually references rhymes of Robin Hood, suggesting that by the 14th century, his legend was already well known among common folk. But those early stories weren't about a noble lord robbing from the rich to help the poor. They were darker, grittier, more violent. In the oldest ballads, Robin Hood is a yeoman, a commoner, not an aristocrat. He's a bandit living in the forests of Barnesdale and Sherwood, ambushing corrupt officials, killing without hesitation, and operating outside the law. He's not fighting for social justice. He's fighting for survival. One of the most important early texts is a Jest of Robin Hood, written in the 15th century. It tells the story of Robin and his merry men living as outlaws in the greenwood, evading the sheriff of Nottingham and challenging the abuses of church and state. In this version, Robin is portrayed as loyal to the true king, often King Richard the Lionheart, while fighting against corrupt officials who exploit the people during the king's absence. But even here, Robin is ruthless. He kills without remorse when crossed, and his sense of justice is personal, not ideological. He helps those who show him respect and punishes those who don't. It's a rough, pragmatic morality shaped by the harsh realities of medieval England, where survival often meant violence. So how did Robin Hood transform from a violent bandit into a champion of the oppressed? The answer lies in centuries of reinterpretation. By the 16th century, writers began reimagining Robin as a nobleman unjustly deprived of his lands, forced into outlawry by corrupt authorities. This aristocratic version made him more palatable to educated audiences, and it added a layer of political drama. Suddenly, Robin wasn't just a criminal. He was a victim of injustice, a rightful lord reclaiming what was stolen from him. And by the 19th century, the romantic image of Robin Hood had fully taken shape, thanks in large part to Sir Walter Scott's novel Ivanhoe, published in 1818. Scott's Robin was noble, chivalrous, and deeply moral, a figure who embodied everything Victorians wanted to believe about English heroism. From that point on, Robin Hood became a symbol of virtue, and his legend was set in stone. But while the story was romanticized in literature, historians kept searching for the real Robin Hood. In 1852, Joseph Hunter, a clergyman and researcher, claimed he'd found him. He discovered records of a Robin Hood who worked as a porter in the court of King Edward II in 1324. According to Hunter, this Robin matched details from the old ballads, including service to a king named Edward and a connection to Wakefield, a town near Sherwood Forest. Hunter speculated that this Robert Hood of Wakefield had been involved in the failed rebellion led by Thomas of Lancaster in 1322, was outlawed, and later pardoned when the king visited Nottingham. It was a compelling theory, and for a while, people believed it. But then a problem emerged. A record surfaced showing that Robin Hood was already working for the king in June 1323, before Edward's trip to Nottingham. The timeline didn't match. Hunter's theory fell apart. Since then, other candidates have been proposed. Some historians point to a fugitive named Robert Hod who appeared in Yorkshire court records in 1226. Others suggest William of Cassingham, a rebel leader in Kent who fought against French invaders in the 13th century using guerrilla tactics and longbows, tactics strikingly similar to those attributed to Robin Hood. But none of these candidates can be definitively proven. The truth is, Robin Hood was probably never one person. He was a composite, an amalgamation of multiple outlaws, rebels, and folk heroes whose stories blended together over centuries of oral tradition. And that's what makes him so powerful. He's not bound by history. He's a symbol that can be reshaped to fit any cause, any era, any struggle. And reshape him, people have. In 1953, during the height of McCarthyism in the United States, a Republican member of the Indiana Textbook Commission named Mrs. Thomas J. White called for Robin Hood to be banned from school books. Her reason? She claimed the legend promoted communism because Robin stole from the rich and gave to the poor, and that this was the smearing of law and order. The accusation sounds absurd now, but it reflected the paranoia of the time, when anything that questioned authority or wealth redistribution was seen as a threat. In response, students at Indiana University launched the Green Feather Movement, dyeing chicken feathers green and distributing them across campus as symbols of resistance against censorship. The movement spread to universities across the country, inspiring solidarity protests at Harvard, UCLA, Michigan, and Chicago. Students wore green feathers and Robin Hood costumes, turning the legend into a weapon against authoritarian overreach. The ban failed. Robin Hood survived. And the Green Feather Movement became a symbol of early youth activism, a precursor to the countercultural movements of the 1960s. Today, Robin Hood is still being fought over. In 2021, Nottingham Castle Trust commissioned a national survey asking over 2,000 people what a modern-day Robin Hood would look like. The results were striking. 78% of respondents said Robin would fight homelessness and poverty. 37% believed he would be an activist by profession. Standing up for women's rights and supporting the Black Lives Matter movement were tied for second place among causes he would champion. The survey revealed something profound. Robin Hood is no longer just a medieval outlaw. He's a living symbol of resistance to inequality, a figure who evolves with each generation to reflect the struggles of the time. In an era of rising wealth gaps, political corruption, and social unrest, Robin Hood represents the desire for justice outside broken systems. But not everyone sees him that way. Some argue that Robin Hood's legacy has been hijacked by modern ideologies. Libertarians and free market advocates claim that Robin Hood was actually fighting against oppressive government taxation, not wealth itself. They argue that the real villain in the legend isn't the rich, it's the Sheriff of Nottingham, a corrupt government official who abuses his power. By this interpretation, Robin Hood was a defender of individual freedom against state tyranny, not a proto-socialist redistributing wealth. It's a radical reinterpretation, but it shows how malleable the legend is. Robin Hood can be claimed by socialists, anarchists, environmentalists, and libertarians alike, each seeing in him a reflection of their own values. And the battles over his legacy aren't just theoretical. In 2018, Kirklees Council in West Yorkshire proposed bulldozing a site known as Robin Hood's grave to make way for an industrial estate. Folklore claims that Robin Hood died at Kirklees Priory and was buried where his final arrow landed. Thousands of people signed a petition objecting to the development, arguing that the site was a powerful symbol of resistance against inequality and oppression. The protests succeeded. The plans were quashed at a public inquiry, proving that Robin Hood's symbolic power is still strong enough to mobilize real-world action. It wasn't just about preserving a piece of land. It was about defending the idea that some stories are too important to bulldoze. More recently, environmental activists have invoked Robin Hood's name in protests against fracking in Sherwood Forest. Demonstrators dressed as Robin Hood and his merry men gathered at the Major Oak, a legendary tree said to have sheltered the Outlaw and his band, to oppose drilling operations. The message was clear: Robin Hood's forest is a symbol of resistance, and those who would exploit it for profit are no different from the corrupt officials he fought centuries ago. The legend lives on because it continues to speak to people who feel powerless, who see injustice and want to fight back. Robin Hood offers them a story, a framework, a hero to rally behind. But here's the irony. While people invoke Robin Hood to fight inequality, one of the most famous companies using his name, the trading app Robinhood, has been repeatedly fined for practices that hurt ordinary investors. In 2020, the SEC fined Robinhood $65 million for misleading customers about how it made money and for providing inferior trade prices that cost users over $34 million. In 2025, Robinhood was fined another $45 million for failing to protect customer data and report suspicious transactions. The company markets itself as democratizing finance, making investing accessible to everyone. But critics argue that it profits off inexperienced traders, gamifies investing, and prioritizes its own revenue over customer welfare. It's the opposite of what Robinhood stood for. The name has been co-opted, turned into a brand, stripped of its meaning. And that's the danger of legends. When they become too popular, they can be commodified, twisted, sold back to the people they were supposed to inspire. So who was Robin Hood? A yeoman bandit? A noble lord? A socialist hero? A libertarian rebel? The answer is all of them and none of them. He's whatever we need him to be in the moment. And maybe that's the real power of his story. It's not about one man. It's about the idea that justice can exist outside the system, that ordinary people can stand up to power, and that sometimes, the only way to fight corruption is to break the rules. Robin Hood doesn't need to be real. He just needs to be believed in. Some legends are carved into stone. Others are carried on wings. At the Tower of London, a fortress that has stood for nearly 1,000 years, 7 large black birds hold the fate of an entire nation in their talons. They're ravens, and according to prophecy, if they ever leave, the tower will crumble to dust, the crown will fall, and Britain itself will collapse. It's one of the strangest superstitions in English history, and the weird part? People still believe it. The tower employs an official raven master whose sole job is to keep the birds fed, healthy, and most importantly, from flying away. But where did this legend come from? Is it ancient folklore passed down through generations? Or is it something else entirely, a modern myth disguised as tradition? The most popular version of the story goes like this. In the 1660s, King Charles II was freshly restored to the throne after a brutal civil war that had seen his father beheaded. England was fragile, and Charles was paranoid. His royal astronomer, John Flamsteed, was working from an observatory in the White Tower, trying to chart the heavens. But the local ravens kept flying past his telescope, obstructing his view and leaving droppings on his instruments. Flamsteed complained to the king and demanded the birds be removed. Charles was inclined to agree, until someone, possibly Flamsteed himself or a nervous courtier, reminded him of an old prophecy. If the ravens ever left the tower, the kingdom would fall. Charles, having already witnessed the fragility of monarchy firsthand, wasn't about to tempt fate. He reversed his order and decreed that at least 6 ravens must remain at the tower at all times. The observatory was moved to Greenwich instead, and the ravens stayed put. The kingdom was saved. Or so the legend says. But here's the problem. There's no evidence that any of this actually happened. Historians have searched the records from Charles II's reign and found nothing about a raven decree. In fact, the earliest known reference to captive ravens at the Tower of London doesn't appear until 1883, over 200 years after Charles supposedly issued his order. That reference is an illustration, not a written account, and it offers no explanation for why the ravens were there. The first written mention of the legend itself doesn't show up until the 20th century, during World War II, when the tower was being reopened to the public after years of closure. Geoffrey Parnell, the tower's official historian, has bluntly stated that the legend is almost certainly a Victorian invention, created to add mystique and drama to the tower as it transitioned from a working fortress into a tourist attraction. And here's the kicker. During World War II, when the tower was bombed and temporarily closed, only 2 ravens remained, a mated pair named Mabel and Grip. Then they both disappeared, possibly flying off to a nearby wood. For a brief period, there were no ravens at the tower at all. And yet, the monarchy didn't fall. The tower didn't crumble. Britain survived. Parnell found a record from that time with the blunt statement, "There are none left." The prophecy was tested, and nothing happened. But instead of abandoning the legend, officials doubled down on it. When the tower reopened, new ravens were brought in, and the tradition was formalized. The myth became reality, not because it was true, but because people wanted it to be. So why did the legend emerge in the first place? One theory involves Druids and ancient Welsh mythology. In the early 20th century, the 4th Earl of Dunraven donated ravens to the tower. His family had been influenced by Ilo Morgannog, a Welsh scholar and forger who convinced them that their castle in Glamorgan had been the original residence of Bran the Blessed, a legendary Welsh king whose name means raven. According to myth, Bran's severed head was buried beneath the White Hill, the site where the Tower of London now stands, and it protected Britain from invasion as long as it remained there. The Earls of Dunraven may have believed that the tower's ravens were avatars of Bran, spiritual guardians of the kingdom. By donating ravens to the tower, they were asserting a mystical claim over the site, tying it back to ancient Celtic mythology. Another theory links the ravens to Victorian literature. After Edgar Allan Poe's poem The Raven was published in 1845, and Charles Dickens featured a talking raven in his novel Barnaby Rudge, Western society became obsessed with these birds. Ravens were suddenly seen as mysterious, intelligent, darkly romantic creatures. The tower, with its gruesome history of executions and imprisonments, was the perfect setting for such symbolism. Ravens had always been scavengers, feeding on the bodies of the executed. Medieval London was full of them, along with pigs and kites, cleaning up the streets. But as the city modernized, wild ravens were driven out. By the late 19th century, they had disappeared from London entirely. Bringing them back to the tower in captivity allowed Victorians to reconnect with a darker, more Gothic vision of England's past. The legend wasn't ancient. It was a product of its time, shaped by Romanticism, nationalism, and a desire to turn history into spectacle. But whether the legend is real or invented doesn't matter to the people who care for the ravens today. Since 1968, the tower has employed an official raven master, a yeoman warder who oversees the health, diet, and well-being of the birds. The current raven master, Michael Barnier Chandler, took over the role in March 2024, becoming only the 6th person in history to hold the title. Chandler is a former Royal Marine who served in Afghanistan, and he takes his responsibility seriously. He leads a team of 4 other yeoman warders, all military veterans, who care for the 7 ravens currently living at the tower. Their names are Jubilee, Harris, Poppy, Georgie, Edgar, Branwen, and Rex, who was named in honor of King Charles III coronation. The ravens are fed a diet of raw meat, supplemented with hard-boiled eggs and biscuits soaked in blood. Their wings are trimmed, not clipped, which makes it harder for them to fly long distances but doesn't harm them. They're incredibly intelligent, as smart as a 7-year-old child, and each one has a distinct personality. Some are playful. Some are aggressive. Some mimic human speech, croaking hello at startled tourists. And occasionally, they escape. In 1981, a raven named Grog flew off and was last seen outside a pub in East London. True to character, even the ravens know where the best spots in town are. But not all escapes have happy endings. In January 2021, Melina, a 14-year-old raven who had lived at the tower since 2007, went missing. She was known as the Queen of the Tower Ravens, a free-spirited bird who often left the grounds but always returned to her nest at night. This time, she didn't. Raven Master Christopher Scaife, who had cared for her for years, feared the worst. Weeks passed with no sign of her. Finally, the tower announced that Melina was missing and presumed dead. The news made headlines around the world. People panicked. If there were fewer than 6 ravens, would the prophecy come true? Would Britain fall? Scaife reassured the public. There were still 7 ravens at the tower, 6 as required by legend, plus 1 spare. The kingdom was safe. For now. But Melina's disappearance was a reminder of how seriously people take this legend, even in the 21st century. Scaife mourned her publicly on social media, where he had built a following of over 120,000 people who loved watching videos of the ravens. Melina had been his favorite, and her loss was personal. In time, a new raven would be added to replace her, continuing the tradition. But for a moment, the legend felt real. The possibility that the kingdom's fate could hinge on a bird's choice to return or fly away was both absurd and deeply unsettling. And maybe that's the point. The raven legend endures not because it's true, but because it taps into something primal. The idea that power is fragile, that fate can turn on the smallest detail, that symbols matter. In an age of political instability, economic uncertainty, and social upheaval, the ravens offer a strange kind of comfort. As long as they're there, perched on the ancient stones, watching over the fortress, things will be okay. It's superstition, yes. But it's also hope. And in a world that feels increasingly chaotic, maybe that's enough. England doesn't just have ghosts. It has monsters. Creatures that stalk the edges of folklore and reality, lurking in the dark spaces where reason breaks down and fear takes over. Some have been sighted for centuries. Others appeared suddenly, terrorized entire communities, and then vanished without explanation. But whether they're ancient legends or modern mysteries, these creatures share one thing in common: they refuse to be forgotten. And in some cases, they're still being seen today. Let's start with the most terrifying of them all, Black Shuck. If you've ever traveled through the misty coastline of East Anglia, through the flatlands of Norfolk, Suffolk, or the Cambridgeshire Fens, you might have heard whispers about a massive black dog with eyes like burning coals. Black Shuck, also called Old Shuck or Old Shock, is one of England's most enduring spectral beasts. His name comes from the Old English word scucker, meaning demon or fiend. And according to legend, if you see him, you're going to die within the year. The most famous account of Black Shuck dates back to August 4, 1577. On that day, a massive thunderstorm rolled across East Anglia, so violent that people thought the world was ending. In the town of Bungay, worshippers gathered at St. Mary's Church for safety. But as the storm raged, the church doors burst open. A huge black dog, surrounded by fire and smoke, tore through the nave at impossible speed. It ran between 2 men kneeling in prayer and snapped their necks backward, killing them instantly. A third man was burned so badly that he shriveled up like a piece of parchment. Then the creature vanished. That same day, at Holy Trinity Church in nearby Blythborough, the same beast appeared, killing another man and a boy, and causing the church steeple to collapse through the roof. As it fled, it left scorch marks on the north door. Those marks are still there today. Locals call them the Devil's Fingerprints. Abraham Fleming, a London publisher, documented the event in a pamphlet titled A Strange and Terrible Wonder. He described the creature as either a black dog or the devil in such a likeness. The story spread like wildfire, cementing Black Shuck's place in English folklore. But here's the thing, people are still seeing him. In the 1920s and 1930s, fishermen in Sheringham reported hearing a phantom hound howling on the cliffs during storms. In 1970, a sighting in Great Yarmouth made the local news. In 1980, a woman walking near Wisbech claimed she encountered the beast while out with her young son. And as recently as the year 2000, someone reported seeing a massive black dog near Thornton Abbey in Grimsby. Black Shuck never went away. He just waits. But not all phantom dogs are death omens. In some parts of Lincolnshire, locals describe black dogs as kindly, even protective. Folklorist Ethel Rudkin, who lived in Willerton, spent years collecting accounts of black dog sightings across northern Lincolnshire. She claimed to have seen one herself and insisted that it was a benign creature, often appearing near rivers and old trackways. Rudkin's work became one of the most thorough studies of black dog folklore in England, and her house now has a blue plaque commemorating her research. But even she acknowledged the darker side. In some stories, the dogs appear where murders or suicides occurred, haunting the sites of tragedy. So which is it? Guardian or harbinger of death? The answer seems to depend on who's telling the story. Then there's Spring-Heeled Jack, one of the strangest figures in Victorian folklore. Between 1837 and 1904, reports flooded in from across England about a terrifying figure who could leap over buildings, breathe blue flames, and attack women in the dark. Witnesses described him as wearing a tight-fitting costume, possibly made of oilskin or metal. His eyes glowed red. His hands ended in metal claws. And his movements defied physics. He could jump 9 feet into the air, land on rooftops, and disappear before anyone could catch him. The first major wave of sightings occurred in London in 1837 and 1838. Women reported being accosted by a figure who would leap out of the darkness, tear at their clothing, and breathe fire into their faces before bounding away with inhuman agility. One victim, 18-year-old Jane Alsop, answered a knock at her door to find a cloaked figure claiming to be a police officer. When she brought him a candle, he threw off his cloak, revealed a terrifying appearance, and vomited blue flames at her. Her screams brought her family running, and the attacker fled, leaping over a 9-foot wall with ease. The Lord Mayor of London, John Cowan, publicly stated that such a creature was not calculated for the meridian of London. But the attacks continued. So who, or what, was Spring-Heeled Jack? Theories ranged from the mundane to the bizarre. Some believed he was a wealthy aristocrat with too much time and money, pranking the lower classes for amusement. Others thought he was a demon, summoned by occultists and unleashed on the city. Paranormal researchers have suggested he was an extraterrestrial, with his fire-breathing abilities and superhuman jumps explained by alien physiology adapted to a high-gravity planet. And some modern psychologists argue that many sightings were hallucinations, a phenomenon known as the old hag experience, where people wake up paralyzed and see terrifying figures in their rooms. But the problem with all these explanations is that Spring-Heeled Jack was seen by multiple witnesses at once, and in some cases, physical evidence was left behind. He wasn't just a dream. He was real to the people who encountered him. By the 1870s and 1880s, Spring-Heeled Jack had evolved into a cultural phenomenon. Penny dreadfuls, cheap serialized stories sold to the working class, turned him into a fictional anti-hero, a misunderstood vigilante fighting injustice. But even as he became entertainment, real sightings continued. In the 1870s, he was spotted in Sheffield and at military bases in Aldershot and Colchester, where soldiers opened fire on him. One soldier reportedly wounded him with a bayonet, but he escaped. His last confirmed sighting was in Liverpool in 1904, where witnesses claimed to see him leaping across rooftops. After that, he vanished. Where did he go? Nobody knows. But his legend influenced generations of cryptid folklore, from Mothman to the Jersey Devil. And then there's the Beast of Bodmin Moor. Since 1978, over 60 reports have described a large, panther-like creature stalking the isolated moors of Cornwall. Witnesses describe a black cat the size of a puma, with sharp teeth, yellow-white eyes, and a long tail that curls upward. Farmers have found mutilated livestock, their throats torn out, their bodies drained. Some people claim to have been chased by the creature. Others have captured it on grainy video footage, blurry but compelling enough to keep the legend alive. In October 1993, the story exploded into national headlines when a woman named Jane Fuller was attacked on the moor near Cardenham. She was walking her dog late at night when something struck her from behind, knocking her to the ground. When she came to, her dog was barking at a large, dark, cat-like creature watching them from the shadows. It had a long tail, 3 to 4 feet in length, and it made grunting noises. Police investigated the scene and found large footprints and strands of hair. The media dubbed it the Beast of Bodmin, and the legend was born. In 1995, the British government launched an official investigation. They sent a wildlife biologist named Charlie Wilson to spend 26 days on the moor, searching for evidence. His conclusion? There was no verifiable evidence of a big cat. All the photographs and footage, he claimed, showed ordinary domestic cats. The footprints belonged to dogs. The livestock deaths had no hint of big cat involvement. But he offered no alternative explanation for what had killed the animals. The report was widely dismissed as a cover-up. Farmers insisted they knew what they'd seen. Rosemary Rhodes, who had filmed what she believed was the beast, told reporters, "Everyone in the country will think we have been suffering from a mass hallucination, but one day there is an outside chance someone is going to get hurt." And the sightings never stopped. People continued to report seeing a large black cat on Bodmin Moor, and attacks on livestock continued. One theory suggests that the beast could be an escaped exotic pet. In the 1960s and 1970s, it was legal to keep big cats as pets in England. When the Dangerous Wild Animals Act was passed in 1976, making it illegal, some owners may have released their animals into the wild rather than face prosecution. It's possible that a breeding population of big cats has survived on Bodmin Moor for decades, hidden in the vast, desolate landscape. But without concrete evidence, the Beast of Bodmin remains a mystery. But of all England's haunted places, one road stands above the rest. Bluebell Hill, the A277 in Kent, has been officially named the most haunted place in the UK. Since 1965, around 50 reports have described a ghostly woman appearing on the road, running out in front of cars, locking eyes with drivers, and then vanishing. The legend stems from a tragic car accident in 1965, when two cars collided near the bridge over Old Chatham Road. 3 out of 4 women in one car died. One of them was a bride-to-be, Suzanne Brown, who was supposed to marry the next day. Many believe her ghost is the one that haunts the road. The most famous incident occurred in 1974, when a bricklayer named Maurice Goodenough hit a young girl on Bluebell Hill late at night. He got out, found her lying in the road with a cut on her forehead and grazes on her knees, and covered her with a blanket. He tried to wave down passing cars, but no one stopped. Fearing she might be seriously injured, he drove to Rochester Police Station to report the accident. When police returned to the scene, the girl was gone. Only the blanket remained. A massive search was launched, using tracker dogs and thermal imaging, but no trace of the girl was ever found. No blood. No scent. No footprints. Goodenough was shaken. He insisted he wasn't going mad. "I know what I saw," he told reporters. But the girl had vanished. Since then, multiple drivers have reported hitting a woman on Bluebell Hill, only for her to disappear when they try to help. Others have reported picking up a female hitchhiker, only for her to vanish from the back seat mid-journey. The ghost is believed to be Patricia Ferguson, one of the women who died instantly in the 1965 crash. Interestingly, a member of her family later revealed that Patricia had a premonition of dying young. She told relatives that she wouldn't live to see adulthood. And she was right. England's monsters and ghosts aren't just stories. They're experiences. They're encounters that defy explanation, that challenge what we think we know about reality. And they're still happening. Right now. Somewhere on a dark road, in a lonely churchyard, or on a windswept moor, someone is seeing something they can't explain. And when they tell their story, it joins the chorus of voices stretching back centuries, all insisting on the same thing: there's something out there. And it's watching. Before the monsters and ghosts, before the dragons and phantom hounds, there were witches. And unlike the other legends we've explored, this one isn't folklore. It's history. In 1612, 10 people were hanged at Gallows Hill in Lancaster, convicted of murder by witchcraft. Their names were Elizabeth Device, James Device, Alison Device, and Whittle, and Redfern, Alice Nutter, Jane Bulcock, John Bulcock, Catherine Hewitt, and Janet Preston. Their crime? Using demonic magic to curse, kill, and terrorize their neighbors. The evidence? A 9-year-old child's testimony, extracted confessions, and a national hysteria so intense that it turned neighbor against neighbor, family against family. This is the story of the Pendle Witches, and it's one of the darkest chapters in English history. It started with pins. In March 1612, a young woman named Alison Device was walking along a road near Pendle Hill in Lancashire when she passed a peddler named John Law. She asked him for some pins, small metal fasteners she needed for clothing. Law refused. Alison, insulted and angry, muttered something under her breath. Moments later, Law collapsed, suffering what was likely a stroke. His son believed his father had been cursed. He reported it to Roger Noel, the local magistrate and justice of the peace, a man already paranoid about witchcraft and religious nonconformity. Noel summoned Alison for questioning. And shockingly, she confessed. She admitted to cursing the peddler and claimed she had sold her soul to the devil. But she didn't stop there. Under pressure, she implicated her grandmother, Elizabeth Southerns, known as Old Demdike, a woman in her 80s who had a reputation as a cunning woman, someone who sold charms and remedies to locals. Alison also accused members of a rival family, the Chattocks clan, led by another elderly woman, and Whittle, known as Old Chattocks. These two families had been feuding for years, competing for clients in a world where poverty drove people to beg, extort, and sell folk magic just to survive. Now, their rivalry would cost them their lives. Noel arrested Demdike, Chattocks, and several others. He interrogated them relentlessly, and under the weight of fear, isolation, and possibly torture, confessions poured out. Demdike admitted to having a familiar spirit named Tib, who appeared to her in the form of a brown dog or a black cat. Chattocks confessed to making clay dolls to curse her enemies. The accusation spiraled. Each suspect named others. And on Good Friday, April 10, 1612, a gathering took place at Malkin Tower, the home of the Device family. What happened there is still debated. Some say it was a family meal, a gathering to discuss how to help those who had been arrested. Others claim it was a witches' sabbath, a demonic ritual where the accused plotted to blow up Lancaster Castle and free their imprisoned relatives. The truth? We'll never know. But the authorities seized on it as proof of a conspiracy. Everyone who attended the Malkin Tower meeting was arrested. By the time the trials began in August 1612, there were 12 accused. But one, Old Demdike, had already died in the dungeons of Lancaster Castle, too old and weak to survive the filthy, freezing conditions. The remaining 11 stood trial before two judges, Sir James Altham and Sir Edward Bromley. And the star witness? A child. 9-year-old Janet Device, daughter of Elizabeth Device and granddaughter of Old Demdike, took the stand and condemned her own family. Janet testified that she had seen her mother, brother, and sister practicing witchcraft. She identified attendees of the Malkin Tower meeting and described rituals, familiars, and curses. Her mother, Elizabeth Device, was so enraged by her daughter's testimony that she had to be physically removed from the courtroom, screaming and cursing. But Janet's word was gospel. King James I, who had become obsessed with witchcraft after surviving what he believed was a plot against him during the North Berwick witch trials in Scotland in 1590, had written a book called Demonology in 1597. In it, he argued that even the testimony of children, criminals, and the morally defamed could be used in witchcraft cases because such crimes were treason against God. Janet's testimony, legally questionable by any modern standard, was enough to seal her family's fate. One by one, the accused were convicted. Alison Device, who had started it all, begged for forgiveness from John Law in open court. He granted it. She wept and admitted she believed herself guilty, but also said she lacked the power to undo the curse. Only Old Demdike, she claimed, could have healed him, and she was already dead. Alison was found guilty. Her mother, Elizabeth Device, was convicted next, damned by her own daughter's words. James Device, Alison's brother, was found guilty based on claims that he had made clay dolls to kill people. And Whittle, Old Chattocks, and her daughter Anne Redfern were both convicted, accused of using witchcraft to murder members of the Nutter family years earlier. And then there was Alice Nutter. Unlike the others, Alice was wealthy, a gentlewoman with land and status. The evidence against her was almost non-existent. But Janet Device testified that Alice had attended the Malkin Tower meeting, and that was enough. Alice was convicted and sentenced to death. To this day, historians debate why Alice Nutter was targeted. Some believe she was caught up in the hysteria. Others suggest she may have been a secret Catholic, and the trial was a way to seize her property and punish religious dissent. The truth died with her. On August 20, 1612, 9 of the convicted were taken to the moors above Lancaster and hanged. A 10th, Janet Preston, had been tried separately at York Assizes and executed days earlier. Their deaths were public spectacles, attended by massive crowds. But this wasn't just about witchcraft. It was about power, fear, and control. England in 1612 was a nation on edge. King James had narrowly survived the Gunpowder Plot in 1605, a Catholic conspiracy to blow up Parliament. Religious tensions between Protestants and Catholics were at a breaking point. The English Reformation had torn communities apart, and people were desperate for someone to blame for their suffering. Witches became scapegoats. And the Pendle trials became a warning: conform, obey, or die. But the story doesn't end there. Thomas Potts, the clerk of the court, published a detailed account of the trials in 1613 called The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the Contai of Lancaster. It was a bestseller, a piece of propaganda designed to glorify the judges and justify the executions. Potts framed the accused as evil, demonic servants of Satan who deserved their fate. His book became one of the most detailed records of a witch trial in English history, and it ensured that the Pendle Witches would never be forgotten. Fast forward to the 21st century. In 1998, a petition was presented to UK Home Secretary Jack Straw asking for the Pendle Witches to be pardoned. It was rejected. The government decided their conviction should stand. But in 2024, another petition was launched, and this time it gained serious momentum. By January 2024, over 10,000 people had signed, demanding a pardon for those executed in 1612. Emma Swinton, a filmmaker from Barrowford and member of the Justice for Witches group, called it shameful that the victims had never been pardoned. She argued that the trials were a miscarriage of justice fueled by religious persecution, political paranoia, and coerced testimony. The petition gained even more traction after a BBC documentary aired in 2024, featuring actress Siân Jones investigating the infamous trials. Public interest exploded. People began asking, why haven't these people been pardoned? In 2018, Switzerland had posthumously pardoned Anna Goldie, the last person executed for witchcraft in Europe in 1782. If Switzerland could acknowledge its past injustices, why couldn't England? Charlotte Meredith, who set up the petition, pointed out that the Witchcraft Act of 1735 had repealed all previous witchcraft laws and recognized that belief in demonic magic was not reality. Yet the people convicted under those laws were never exonerated. They remain, in the eyes of English law, guilty. But here's where it gets complicated. Some historians argue that pardoning the Pendle Witches is symbolically important but legally meaningless. They're dead. A pardon won't bring them back. Others say it matters precisely because symbols matter. Acknowledging past injustices is how societies heal. It's how we recognize that fear, paranoia, and prejudice can turn legal systems into weapons of oppression. And it's a reminder that witch hunts, literal or metaphorical, are never really about witchcraft. They're about power. And witchcraft itself? It's experiencing a revival. In the 1950s, Britain repealed the last of its witchcraft laws, and modern Wicca was born, founded by Gerald Gardner. By the 1960s and 1970s, witchcraft had become a countercultural movement, embraced by feminists, environmentalists, and spiritual seekers. Today, over 74,000 people in England, Scotland, and Wales identify as pagan or part of a modern witchcraft tradition. Social media platforms like TikTok and Instagram have given rise to a new generation of witches who blend ancient practices with modern sensibilities. Witchcraft, once punishable by death, is now a form of spiritual exploration and self-expression. So what do we make of the Pendle Witches? Were they healers, cunning folk who sold charms and remedies to survive? Were they victims of a rigged legal system designed to eliminate the poor, the marginalized, and the nonconformist? Or did they genuinely believe they had supernatural powers, shaped by a world where magic and religion were intertwined? The answer is probably all of the above. They were human beings caught in a moment of history where paranoia, poverty, and politics collided with lethal consequences. And their story is a warning. Because witch hunts never really end. They just change form. And the question we need to ask ourselves is this: who are we hunting today? Not every legend gets the spotlight. While King Arthur and Robin Hood dominate the headlines, England's folklore is filled with dozens of lesser-known figures, creatures that lurk in the margins of history, quietly shaping local traditions and whispering warnings to those brave enough to listen. These are the hidden myths, the forgotten spirits, and the stories that were too strange, too dark, or too uncomfortable for mainstream culture to fully embrace. But they're still out there, carved into church walls, whispered in village pubs, and occasionally, still being seen. And some of them might reveal truths that the more famous legends tried to bury. Let's start with one of the most enigmatic figures in English folklore, the Green Man. If you've ever visited a medieval church in England, chances are you've seen him. A face made of leaves, vines sprouting from his mouth, eyes peering out from a tangle of foliage. He's everywhere, carved into stone corbels, wooden roof beams, and misericords. But who is he? And why is a pagan symbol plastered all over Christian churches? The term Green Man wasn't coined until 1939, when Lady Raglan published an article in the journal Folklore connecting these foliate heads to pagan fertility gods and May Day celebrations. She argued that the Green Man represented an ancient nature deity, a symbol of death and rebirth, whose worship predated Christianity by centuries. Her theory became wildly popular, especially among New Age and neo-pagan movements in the 1960s and 70s, who adopted the Green Man as a symbol of environmentalism and spiritual connection to nature. But here's the problem: Lady Raglan had no evidence. Historians and folklorists have since pointed out that foliate heads don't appear in England until the 12th century, centuries after Christianity was established. They're not pagan relics. They're medieval Christian art. So what do they actually represent? One theory ties the Green Man to a medieval text called the Golden Legend, which tells the story of Seth, son of Adam. According to the legend, when Adam was dying, Seth traveled to the Garden of Eden and received 3 seeds from the Tree of Life. He placed them under Adam's tongue when he was buried, and from Adam's body grew 3 trees, which eventually provided the wood for the true cross. The Green Man, with vines emerging from his mouth, may symbolize this story, a Christian allegory about renewal, resurrection, and the transformation of paganism through the cross. It's not a pagan god sneaking into churches. It's a Christian symbol of redemption, hidden in plain sight. But the Green Man's meaning has evolved. In modern times, he's been reclaimed by environmental movements as a symbol of humanity's connection to nature and the cycles of growth and decay. The irony? The very symbol that medieval Christians used to represent the triumph of their faith over paganism is now being used to challenge industrialization, deforestation, and climate destruction. The Green Man has become a rebel again, but this time, he's fighting a different kind of empire. Then there's Herne the Hunter, one of England's most terrifying ghostly figures. Herne is said to haunt Windsor Forest, appearing as a spectral huntsman with massive antlers growing from his head, riding a ghostly horse and accompanied by phantom hounds. His presence is an omen of disaster, national tragedy, or the death of a monarch. The earliest written account of Herne comes from Shakespeare's The Merry Wives of Windsor, written around 1597, where he's described as a former forest keeper who hanged himself from an oak tree and now haunts the woods at midnight, blasting trees and bewitching cattle. But was Herne a real person? Some historians believe he was Richard Herne, master of the hunt under King Richard II. According to legend, Herne saved the king's life during a hunt when a stag attacked, but was mortally wounded in the process. A mysterious figure, possibly a magician or forest spirit, healed Herne, but his enemies at court framed him for poaching and treason. Disgraced and dishonored, Herne hanged himself from an oak tree. His ghost began appearing soon after, seeking revenge on those who betrayed him. 2 of his accusers were found dead, hanging from the same tree, their faces frozen in terror. Other scholars connect Herne to much older legends. Jacob Grimm, the folklorist who collected fairy tales with his brother, suggested that Herne was connected to the Wild Hunt, a pan-European myth about a spectral procession of hunters led by a god or demon racing across the sky during storms. In Germanic mythology, the Wild Hunt was led by Odin. In English folklore, it became Herne. The Wild Hunt was believed to be a death omen. Anyone who saw it would die within the year or be swept up into the hunt themselves, condemned to ride with the dead forever. Sightings of Herne continued well into the 20th century. During World War I, soldiers reported seeing a spectral huntsman near Windsor before major battles. In the 1960s, witnesses claimed to have seen a figure with antlers riding through the forest at night. And in 1976, a group of tourists photographed what they believed was Herne's oak, the tree where he supposedly died. The tree has been replaced multiple times over the centuries, and the current oak designated as Herne's oak was planted in 1906. But the legend refuses to die. Whether Herne was a real person, a composite of older myths, or a symbolic warning about betrayal and justice, his story continues to haunt Windsor Forest. And then there's Jack the Giant Killer, a Cornish folk hero who became one of the most violent and gory figures in English folklore. Jack's tale is simple. During the reign of King Arthur, a young farm boy from Cornwall named Jack decides to rid his homeland of the giants terrorizing the countryside. He digs a pit, tricks the first giant, Cormoran, into falling in, and kills him with a pickaxe to the skull. The townspeople are so grateful they give him a belt inscribed with the words, "Here's the right valiant Cornishman, who slew the giant Cormoran." But Jack doesn't stop there. He goes on a killing spree, slaughtering giant after giant using tricks, traps, and magical items like an invisible cloak, winged shoes, and a sword that can cut through anything. The tales are shockingly brutal. Jack slits a giant's belly open while he's sleeping. He tricks another into stabbing himself. He decapitates a two-headed Welsh giant and feeds his organs to his dogs. These aren't sanitized fairy tales. They're gory, violent revenge fantasies, and they were hugely popular in 18th and 19th century England, printed as cheap chapbooks and sold to working-class readers. Why were these stories so popular? One theory is that Jack represented the underdog, the clever commoner who could outwit and destroy the powerful. Giants were symbols of oppressive authority, wealthy landowners, corrupt officials, anyone who abused their power. Jack's violence wasn't senseless. It was cathartic. It gave readers a fantasy of fighting back against systems that crushed them. And that made Jack dangerous. Because when folklore becomes a tool for imagining resistance, it stops being just entertainment. It becomes political. But Jack the Giant Killer also reveals something darker. Some scholars argue that the tale was invented in the early 18th century, not as ancient folklore, but as a commercial product designed to cash in on the public's appetite for violence and adventure. The earliest printed version dates to 1711, and there are almost no references to Jack before that. Thomas Green, a folklorist, suggests that Jack was created to fill the gap left by King Arthur, whose popularity had waned after La Morte d'Arthur went out of print in 1634. Jack was a replacement hero, a working-class Arthur who didn't need a sword in a stone to prove his worth. He just needed guts and a pickaxe. And then there are the figures that never made it into mainstream folklore at all. Tid Mun, a bog spirit from the Lincolnshire Fens, who controlled water and mist and cursed entire villages when they drained his marshland home. Peg Powler, a green-skinned hag who dragged children into the River Tees and drowned them, her foam still visible on the water's surface. The Knockers, underground creatures who warned miners of cave-ins by tapping on the walls, but who would turn vengeful if disrespected. These figures were local, specific to small communities, and they never got the national attention of Robin Hood or St. George. But they mattered to the people who believed in them. They were warnings, explanations, and sometimes, comfort. Because that's what folklore does. It fills in the gaps that history and religion leave behind. It explains why children drown in rivers, why crops fail, why disasters strike without warning. And it gives people power, the power to appease spirits, to outwit giants, to resist authority. But it also reveals what societies are afraid of. The monsters we create say more about us than they do about the world. Black dogs represent death. Giants represent tyranny. Witches represent the fear of women who won't conform. And the Green Man? He represents the fear that no matter how much we try to control nature, it will always reclaim us in the end. So why don't we know these stories as well as we know Arthur or Robin Hood? Because some legends are easier to sell than others. Heroes who serve kings, knights who defend the church, outlaws who steal from the corrupt but never challenge the system itself, those are safe stories. But legends about spirits who punish those who destroy the environment? Folk heroes who use violence to overthrow the powerful? Symbols of death and rebirth that suggest nothing lasts forever, not even kingdoms? Those are harder to control. Those are dangerous. And maybe that's why they were hidden. Not forgotten, but pushed to the edges, carved into corners of churches where most people wouldn't look, whispered in local dialects that outsiders couldn't understand, passed down in families rather than written in books. Because the most powerful stories aren't always the ones everyone knows. Sometimes, they're the ones that survive in the shadows, waiting for the moment when people need them again. And judging by the resurgence of interest in folklore, environmentalism, and resistance to authority, that moment might be now. Magic has always haunted the edges of England's folklore, the thin line between miracle and menace, wisdom and heresy. For every king crowned by divine right, there was always a shadow figure whispering secrets, bending fate, and making deals no priest would ever bless. Wizards, witches, and fairies, the old powers of the land, were never gone. They were just waiting, hiding under new names. And the stories told about them still carry a warning: power always has a price. One of the most enduring stories is that of the Wizard of Alderley Edge, a legend steeped in mystery and prophecy. The story begins with a poor farmer from Cheshire leading his white mare to the market in Macclesfield. Along the way, he meets an old man dressed in a long cloak who offers to buy the horse for a fair price. The farmer refuses, hoping to get more money in town. But no one at the market will touch the horse, as if under a spell. Frustrated, the farmer heads home, only to find the same old man waiting for him on the road. The stranger repeats his offer, and this time, the farmer accepts. The old man leads him to Alderley Edge, a dramatic sandstone cliff rising over the plain below. There, he taps on the rock with his staff, and the stone wall swings open, revealing a cavern deep within the earth. The farmer follows him inside, where he sees an army of sleeping knights in silver armor, each lying beside a snow-white horse. These are the warriors of a long-dead king, the wizard explains. They sleep here, waiting for the day when Britain is in its greatest peril. Then, they will awaken and ride out to save the land. But one horse is missing, and your mare will complete the company. The wizard pays the farmer with gold and jewels, then escorts him back to the surface. The rock closes behind them. When the farmer returns home, his pockets are full of treasure, but he can never find the entrance again. The wizard and his hidden army have vanished. Locals still say that under Alderley Edge, the knights wait, ready to rise when England faces its darkest hour. The legend has inspired generations of writers, including Alan Garner, whose novel The Weird Stone of Brisingamen brought the myth to modern readers. And every so often, people still report strange lights flickering in the hill at night. Beyond the caves, England's folklore is filled with tricksters and spirits from the Twilight world. Puck, also known as Robin Goodfellow, is one of the most famous. He's the shape-shifting fairy who dances on the border between mischief and morality. Shakespeare turned him into a comic figure in A Midsummer Night's Dream, but the older folklore paints a far wilder picture. Puck wasn't a cute creature with wings. He was a spirit of the land, unpredictable, chaotic, and proud. If you treated your home with care and left offerings, a bowl of cream, a slice of bread, Puck would bless you. If you disrespected him, he could turn your life into a nightmare. Farmers swore they could hear Puck working at night, threshing grain or churning butter when everyone else was asleep. But if anyone tried to catch him in the act, his nature turned cruel. He would sour the milk, tangle the horses' manes, or make travelers wander in circles until dawn. Puck represented the uneasy truce between humans and the unseen world, a deal you didn't want to break. The moral of his stories was always the same: respect what you can't see, or lose everything trying to control it. And then there were the Piskies of Cornwall, tiny wild spirits who lived among the moors and cliffs. They loved to dance under the moonlight in rings of grass, their laughter echoing through the fog. Like Puck, they could be helpful or malicious depending on how they were treated. Farmers left them food and milk in return for protection. But if you mocked them or spied on their dances, they would piscilate you, trapping you in an illusion where the landscape turned in circles and familiar paths twisted endlessly. To break free, you had to turn your pockets inside out, reversing their spell. Even now, hikers on the moors sometimes report disorientation, sudden fog, and a sense that unseen eyes are watching them. Cornwall's mythology also stretches underground, into the dark tunnels of its old tin mines. There, miners spoke of the Knockers, small, bearded men who lived deep in the earth, tapping on the rocks. Some said these spirits were ghosts of miners who died in collapses. Others claimed they were ancient earth spirits guarding their domain. The miners were careful to stay on their good side. Before lunch, they left bits of pasty, the crust corners, in small holes as offerings. If you respected them, the Knockers would guide you toward rich veins of ore. But if you offended them, they would mislead you into dangerous shafts or cause a cave-in. When Cornish miners emigrated to America, South Africa, and Australia, they took the legend with them. To this day, miners in parts of the world still talk about Tomic Knockers, spirits that warn of danger before disaster strikes. And not all spirits were kind. Jenny Greenteeth haunted ponds and rivers across northern England. She was described as a hag with green, algae-like hair, sharp teeth, and cold white eyes. She hid under mats of duckweed, waiting for children who strayed too close to the water's edge. When they leaned in, she would drag them down and drown them. Parents told her story to keep children safe from treacherous ponds, but her legend may also have roots in something older, the idea that water has its own guardians, jealous of trespassers. Some folklorists suggest that Jenny Greenteeth represents an ancient river goddess reduced to a monster over time. A being that once demanded sacrifice, later turned into a cautionary tale. And then there is Tid Mun, a bog spirit of the Lincolnshire fens. He was said to be an old man no taller than a toddler, with long white hair and a grey cloak made of mist. Tid Mun controlled the water levels of the fens, making floods or droughts depending on his mood. When engineers from the Netherlands drained the marshes in the 17th century to create farmland, locals said Tid Mun grew furious. He cursed the land with sickness and flood until the townspeople performed a ritual of apology, pouring water back into the bogs and calling his name 3 times under the new moon. Only then did the pestilence cease. He may have been small, but his power was vast, the spirit of nature fighting back against human arrogance. Every one of these tales hides the same truth: magic is never free. Whether you strike a bargain with a wizard, summon a fairy for help, or disturb an ancient spirit's land, the cost always comes due. England's folklore isn't about escapism, it's about consequences. The wizard gives riches, but you lose what you love. The fairy grants favors, but she owns you afterward. The spirit of the water saves your crops, but claims a life in return. These are stories about control, or rather, the illusion of control, and what happens when humans forget their place in the natural order. Today, these legends live on in surprising ways. From fantasy novels and video games to environmental activism and spiritual movements, England's old magic has found new voices. The Wizard of Alderley Edge becomes a metaphor for hidden wisdom. Jenny Greenteeth embodies the vengeance of polluted rivers. Puck and the Piskies remind us that chaos and laughter are part of life's rhythm. The Knockers are still knocking, warning us, sometimes literally, of what happens when we dig too deep. Because in England, the past isn't gone. It's just sleeping underground, waiting for someone brave, or foolish, enough to wake it. Folklore is supposed to bring people together, right? Legends about knights, giants, witches, and fairies, stories everyone can share, a kind of cultural glue. But in 21st century England, the tug-of-war over who owns these old stories has erupted into one of the most heated cultural debates of our time. Instead of being a safe place for shared imagination, English folklore has become a battleground for politics, nationalism, and the search for identity. And as the pressure builds, even the quietest ghost story can become a lightning rod for public controversy. It starts with the question of identity. For decades, England's folk tales were celebrated as a way to connect people to place, to give meaning to the land, the ancestors, the rhythms of rural life. But after World War II, and especially post-Brexit, those same stories have become objects of suspicion. Some politicians, wary of anything that sounds too nationalist, have distanced themselves from English folklore. There's a real fear that these legends can be co-opted by the far right, twisted into slogans of England for the English, or wielded to exclude immigrants and people of colour. The St. George's flag, once a symbol of unity, was adopted in the 1970s by extremist groups and became associated with racial tension, much like the Confederate flag in the US. For many, the flag, and by extension, the old stories, still carry that uncomfortable baggage. As a result, English folklore gets both celebrated and censored, sometimes in the same breath. Yet there's another side to the story. While some have tried to use myths to stoke fear and division, others have fought to reclaim them for everyone. A growing movement of artists, scholars, and community leaders are working to make English folklore more inclusive, highlighting its deep multicultural roots. After all, Britain has been invaded and settled by Romans, Vikings, Normans, Huns, Africans, and dozens of others across thousands of years. Some of England's best-known legends, from fairy tales to the story of Robin Hood, are fusions of French, Germanic, Celtic, Norse, and Mediterranean traditions. The new narratives insist that the legend of England is not a story of blood and soil, but a messy, creative patchwork, always evolving, always absorbing new voices. Artists and activists are inventing new rituals, rewriting old stories with LGBTQ, disabled, and immigrant heroes, and using folklore festivals to celebrate the country's diversity and resilience. Museums and universities, through projects like Britain's National Folklore Survey and major exhibitions at the British Academy, are spotlighting how immigration, colonial history, and the environment have shaped folk tales for centuries. Digital storytelling has exploded online, where folklore no longer needs an official stamp to thrive, it just needs someone to tell it, remix it, or meme it for the next generation. Folklore is alive, and it belongs to anyone moved by its magic. Still, the debate is far from settled. To some, reclaiming folklore for progressive causes is itself an act of erasure, severing stories from their roots and replacing local color with bland multiculturalism. To others, doubling down on authentic myths invites nostalgia for a version of England that never really existed, an England without immigrants, dissenters, or change. There's genuine anxiety about what will be lost if folk traditions simply become tools for branding or political persuasion. But there's also hope that folklore can be both rooted and radical, both old and new, both comforting and dangerous. Maybe that's what makes English folklore so powerful and so controversial. It resists control, just like the best stories do. It can be wielded to divide or to heal. It can be a door slammed shut, or a path opened wide. In this moment of crisis, folklore is once again a battlefield. But regardless of who wins the fight, the stories will keep changing, morphing, and adapting, because a living tradition never truly dies. It only grows. So here we are, at the end of our journey through England's darkest and most enduring legends. We've walked with kings who may never have lived, heard the howl of phantom dogs in the mist, stood beside witches on the gallows, and listened to the ravens croak their warnings from the tower. We've met giants, fairies, and spectral hunters. We've uncovered stories that were hidden, censored, or forgotten. And through it all, one truth has become impossible to ignore: these legends are not relics of the past. They're alive. They're evolving. And they're more relevant now than they've been in centuries. Think about it. King Arthur is still being rediscovered in hidden manuscripts and debated in university lecture halls. Robin Hood's name is invoked at protests and plastered on trading apps. The Pendle Witches are the subject of petitions demanding justice 400 years after their deaths. Black Shuck is still being cited on lonely roads. And the Green Man, carved into churches 8 centuries ago, has become a symbol of the environmental movement. These stories refuse to die because they tap into something deeper than history. They tap into fear, hope, injustice, and the eternal human need to make sense of a chaotic world. But here's the uncomfortable part. The same legends that inspire artists and activists can also be weaponized. The same myths that bring communities together can be used to tear them apart. St. George, the dragon slayer, is both a symbol of courage and a rallying cry for exclusionary nationalism. Robin Hood is claimed by socialists and libertarians alike, each side insisting he represents their values. And the debate over who gets to tell England stories, who gets to define what it means to be English, has become one of the most divisive cultural battles of our time. Folklore isn't neutral. It never was. It's a mirror reflecting back the fears, hopes, and contradictions of the people who tell it. And maybe that's the point. Legends aren't meant to be safe. They're meant to challenge us, to make us uncomfortable, to force us to ask hard questions. Why do we celebrate some stories and bury others? Why do we turn outlaws into heroes and heroes into villains? Why do we cling to myths about a once and future king when we know that history is messy, violent, and far more complicated than any legend can capture? The truth is, we need these stories precisely because they're not true. They give us a framework to imagine something better, or at least, something different. But there's a danger in that, too. When we become too attached to our myths, when we start believing they represent some kind of eternal truth, we stop questioning them. We stop seeing the ways they can be manipulated, the ways they can be used to justify cruelty, exclusion, and oppression. The witch trials weren't just about superstition. They were about control, about punishing people who didn't conform. The legend of the ravens at the tower wasn't ancient prophecy. It was Victorian branding, designed to sell tickets and reinforce national identity. And the dragons? They were always stand-ins for whoever the powerful wanted to destroy. The monsters in our stories aren't random. They're chosen. So where does that leave us? We've spent an hour exploring the myths, legends, and ghosts of England, and the question we're left with is the same one people have been asking for centuries: what do we do with these stories? Do we preserve them exactly as they were, treating them as sacred relics that must never change? Do we rewrite them, adapt them, make them more inclusive and relevant to the modern world? Or do we let them go, acknowledging that some legends have outlived their usefulness and should be allowed to fade into history? The answer, of course, is that we do all three. Because that's what folklore has always done. It preserves, it adapts, and it forgets. Some stories survive because they speak to something universal. Others disappear because they no longer serve a purpose. And the ones that endure? They change. They evolve. They take on new meanings with every generation that tells them. King Arthur was a Welsh warlord, then a French romance hero, then a Tudor propaganda tool, then a symbol of British imperialism, and now, in some circles, a progressive icon of justice and equality. He's been all of these things and none of them. Because Arthur isn't a person. He's an idea. And ideas are immortal. The same is true for all of England's legends. They're not fixed. They're fluid. They're shaped by the people who tell them, the moments they're told in, and the reasons they're remembered. And that's what makes them so powerful. They give us permission to imagine a different world. A world where the powerless can fight back. Where the dead don't stay buried. Where magic still exists, even if we can't see it. Where justice, however delayed, eventually arrives. Where the things we've lost, the people we've mourned, the hope we've abandoned, can somehow return. But that permission comes with responsibility. Because the stories we tell shape the world we live in. They teach us who to trust and who to fear. They define who belongs and who doesn't. They justify war and peace, rebellion and obedience, kindness and cruelty. And if we're not careful, they can trap us in the past, making it impossible to imagine a future that looks different from the one our ancestors lived. That's the paradox of folklore. It connects us to our roots, but it can also chain us to them. So as we close this chapter, here's the question you need to ask yourself: what stories are you telling? Not just the old ones, the legends passed down through centuries, but the new ones. The ones you're creating right now, through the choices you make, the values you uphold, the people you support, and the injustices you refuse to ignore. Because folklore isn't just about the past. It's about the future. The stories we tell today will become the legends of tomorrow. And the ghosts we create now will haunt the next generation. England's myths are alive because people keep them alive. They survive in whispered conversations, in viral videos, in midnight walks through haunted forests, in petitions demanding justice for the dead, and in the quiet moments when someone sees something they can't explain and wonders, just for a second, if maybe the old stories were true after all. The ravens are still at the tower. The witches are still waiting for their pardon. The black dogs are still howling in the mist. And somewhere, deep beneath the hills, the knights are still sleeping, waiting for the call to rise. Are the real ghosts of England its legends? Or are they the secrets it still refuses to admit? Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe the truth is that England, like all places, is haunted by the choices it made and the stories it chose to tell. And those ghosts will never leave. They'll just keep changing shape, adapting to new fears, new hopes, new battles. Because that's what legends do. They endure. They evolve. And they echo, endlessly, through time. So the next time you hear a story about a king who never was, a dragon that never lived, or a ghost that refuses to die, ask yourself, what is this story really about? What fear is it hiding? What hope is it carrying? And most importantly, what story will you tell when it's your turn to speak? Because in the end, we're all storytellers. And the legends we leave behind will define us long after we're gone. The whispers in the English landscape haven't stopped. They're just waiting for someone to listen.